In a deteriorating Detroit neighborhood, a 92-year-old retired colonel was about to face his greatest test since Korea. What started as tending his morning garden took a shocking turn when three desperate gang members broke into his home seeking easy money. Sam Reeves wasn't your typical elderly victim. For 70 years, he had carried classified Korean War secrets, known for his unwavering military discipline. When they stole his locked briefcase, they had no idea they were triggering a national security crisis. Sam's encrypted phone call would unleash special forces within 45 minutes. What began as simple burglary became a neighborhood occupation that revealed some secrets are worth everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the yellowed curtains of Colonel Samuel Reeves's modest kitchen, casting familiar shadows across the worn linoleum floor. At 92, Sam's hands moved with practiced precision as he prepared his coffee. 2 spoonfuls of grounds, measured exactly as he'd done for the past 60 years in this same house. The ritual grounded him, a constant in a neighborhood that seemed to transform daily around him. Through his kitchen window, Sam watched the Hernandez boy hurry past, backpack bouncing as he rushed toward school. The sight brought a faint smile to the old colonel's weathered face. Some things remained unchanged. Children still walked these streets with hope in their steps, even if those streets bore scars that hadn't existed when Sam first moved here. In 1965, the coffee maker gurgled to life as Sam stepped onto his back porch, surveying the small garden that had become his morning sanctuary. His tomatoes were coming along nicely despite the poor soil, a testament to patience and stubborn determination. He'd learned both qualities during his years in uniform, though the memories of where and why sometimes felt heavier than his aging. Bones could bear. "Discipline keeps a man whole," he murmured to himself, the words his old sergeant had drilled into him decades ago. Even now, Sam maintained his military bearing, straight shoulders, measured movements, eyes that missed nothing. Despite their age, the neighborhood kids called him the Colonel, with a respect that warmed him more than they'd ever know. Sam knelt carefully beside his tomato plants, his knees protesting but his will unyielding. As he worked, his mind drifted to the morning's mail, another letter from the Veterans Administration, probably about his benefits. A property tax notice that made him wince. The city wanted more money for services that seemed to diminish each year. And tucked beneath the bills, a card from Elena. His protégé checked on him monthly, though her current deployment kept their conversations brief. The sound of footsteps on his front walk drew Sam's attention. Mrs. Chen approached with her careful, measured gait, carrying the thermos that meant their weekly tea ritual was about to begin. Dorothy Chen had been his neighbor for 37 years, arriving from Seoul with her late husband when the neighborhood still bloomed with possibility. "Good morning, Samuel," she called in her precise English, tinged with the accent she'd never quite shed. "Your garden looks strong this year." "Morning, Dorothy. Coffee's fresh if you prefer it to that herbal stuff you brought." She smiled, settling into the porch chair he'd positioned for her visits. "Today, we tried jasmine tea, very good for old bones." As she prepared the tea with ceremonial care, Sam found himself studying her face. Dorothy had aged more gracefully than the neighborhood around them, her features weathered but dignified. She'd seen Seoul before the war, remembered a Korea that existed only in fading photographs now. Sometimes Sam wondered if she suspected the weight he carried from that distant peninsula. "The Morrison house sold," Dorothy said, pouring tea into delicate cups she'd brought from home. "Young family with children. Perhaps things will improve." Sam accepted the cup, inhaling the floral steam. Good. Children make a neighborhood alive. But they both knew the pattern. Young families moved in with optimism, stayed a few years, then fled to safer suburbs when reality set in. The cycle had repeated itself dozens of times during Sam's tenure here. Yet he remained, rooted by more than just habit. "You know," Dorothy said carefully, "I saw those boys watching your house yesterday evening, the Williams boy and his friends." Sam's tea paused halfway to his lips. Marcus Williams, 19 years old, intelligent eyes shadowed by street wisdom, earned too young. Sam had watched him grow up, seen the potential buried beneath anger and circumstance. The boy reminded him of soldiers he'd known, young men forced to make hard choices in impossible situations. "Marcus isn't bad," Sam said finally. "Just lost." "Lost can become dangerous when desperation sets in," Dorothy replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd fled one war only to watch another unfold in slow motion. "These streets change people." They sat in comfortable silence, sipping tea as the neighborhood awakened around them. A police siren wailed in the distance, common enough to barely register. Mrs. Patterson hurried past with her grocery cart, offering a wave, but not stopping. The mailman's truck rumbled down the street, bringing its daily mix of hope and obligation. As the sun climbed higher, Dorothy gathered her tea service with practiced efficiency. "Be careful, Samuel. Sometimes the past catches up when we least expect it." Her words carried an odd weight, as if she knew more than she revealed. But then, Dorothy had always been perceptive, perhaps recognizing in Sam the same shadows that haunted her own memories of a war-torn homeland. After she left, Sam returned to his garden, but found his concentration broken. Marcus Williams and his crew, Tommy Martinez and the Thompson boy, Deshawn. Sam knew their names, their stories, their potential. In another time, another place, he might have guided them toward better paths, but the neighborhood's current reality offered few alternatives to the streets that claimed so many young men. The afternoon passed quietly. Sam read mail on his porch, including a letter from his old unit's newsletter. Fewer names each year, more obituaries than updates. The weight of being among the last witnesses to certain events pressed heavily on his chest. As evening approached, Sam retreated inside for his simple dinner. Through his front window, he noticed unusual movement across the street. 3 figures moving with purpose but trying to appear casual. Marcus, Tommy, and Deshawn, their attention focused on his house. Sam's military instinct stirred, recognizing surveillance when he saw it. These boys were planning something, and the realization brought equal measures of disappointment and understanding. Desperation drove men to choices they'd never imagine, making under normal circumstances. He'd seen it in Korea, in countless situations where survival trumped morality. The house settled into evening quiet as Sam prepared for bed. His nightly routine included checking the locks, a habit born of military precision rather than paranoia. The front door deadbolt, the back door chain, the basement entrance. Finally, he made his way to the bedroom closet, kneeling carefully, to retrieve the small, locked briefcase hidden beneath old uniforms. The case felt heavier each year, though its contents hadn't changed. Inside lay documents that had shaped the last 70 years of his life, papers that recorded choices made in the heat of combat, decisions that saved lives and ended others, evidence of things done in service to country that could never see daylight without destroying reputations, families, legacies. Sam returned the briefcase to its hiding place, whispering a prayer he'd repeated for decades. "Grant me strength to bear what cannot be changed, and wisdom to know when silence serves. Justice better than truth." The house creaked around him as he settled into sleep, unaware that 3 young men had already made their decision. In a few hours, the briefcase he'd guarded so carefully would be gone, setting in motion events that would transform not just his quiet neighborhood, but the lives of everyone connected to secrets buried in Korean soil 70 years before. Outside, Marcus Williams checked his watch and gave a subtle nod to his crew. The old man's lights had been out for an hour. Time to move. The phone rang at 0347 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of Sam's bedroom like a blade through silence. His eyes snapped open with the clarity of a man trained never to be fully asleep, but his body protested as he reached for the receiver. The intruders had been gone for 20 minutes, leaving behind overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and a hollow space in his closet where 70 years of buried secrets once lay hidden. "This is Reeves," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his arthritic hands. On the other end, the duty officer at Fort Bragg responded with practiced efficiency. "Sir, connecting you to Olympus Control." Sam's chest tightened. Olympus. Control, the code name for the network he'd hoped never to activate. As the connection clicked through encrypted channels, he stared at the chaos of his violated home, knowing that his next words would unleash forces he could no longer control. 1,200 miles away, Captain Elena Vasquez had been reviewing tactical scenarios when her encrypted phone buzzed with a priority alert. The display showed a code she'd memorized but never expected to see, Broken Arrow 7. Her coffee cup hit the floor, ceramic exploding across the briefing room as recognition flooded through her. "Colonel Reeves," she breathed, her professional composure cracking for just a moment before military training reasserted itself. Elena's relationship with Sam transcended the usual mentor-student dynamic. He'd found her as a young sergeant, raw from combat but burning with potential, and shaped her into the officer she'd become. More than that, he'd filled the void left by a father who'd never returned from his own war. When Sam spoke the activation phrase, "The wolves have taken the shepherd's staff," Eleanor felt the bottom drop out of her world. "Asset secured?" she asked, though his presence on the line already answered the question. "Affirmative. Package is compromised. Unknown actors, local origin, requesting immediate containment and recovery." Eleanor's mind raced through protocols she'd hoped never to implement. Broken Arrow 7 wasn't just about classified documents. It was about Sam himself, one of the military's most closely guarded secrets. A living legend whose knowledge and past operations made him a national security asset of the highest order. "Understood, sir. Initiating full response. ETA 6 hours. As Elena coordinated with her team, another phone rang in the Pentagon's Secure Communications Center. General Patricia Hayes lifted the receiver with the weariness of someone accustomed to crisis calls at ungodly hours. But when the duty officer briefed her on the situation, fatigue vanished instantly. "How long has the package been missing?" Hayes demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Approximately 47 minutes, ma'am." Hayes closed her eyes, calculating the implications. The documents Sam had safeguarded weren't just evidence of war crimes. They were proof of decisions made at the highest levels of government, choices that had shaped American foreign policy for decades. In the wrong hands, they could topple administrations and destroy careers that had taken lifetimes to build. "I want every available resource on this," she ordered. "Federal, military, intelligence, everything. And I want it contained before dawn." 3 time zones away, Agent David Park's phone shattered the pre-dawn quiet of his Chicago apartment. As a Korean-American federal investigator, Park had built his career on methodical precision and cultural sensitivity. The theft of classified documents related to Korean War operations fell squarely within his expertise, though the briefing officer's urgency suggested layers of complexity beyond a simple burglary. "Pack for extended deployment," his supervisor instructed. "Your wheels up to Detroit in 2 hours. This one comes from the very top." Park dressed quickly, his mind already analyzing what little information he'd been given. A 92-year-old veteran, classified documents from 1953, a neighborhood break-in that had triggered a national security response. The pieces didn't quite fit together, but something about the Korean connection stirred an uneasy familiarity he couldn't place. In Detroit, Detective Ray Johnson's radio crackled to life as he patrolled the early morning streets. A routine burglary call in the Corktown district, nothing unusual for his beat. But when dispatch provided the address, Johnson's attention sharpened. Sam Reeves's house, the old colonel who'd become something of a neighborhood institution, respected by residents and criminals alike. Johnson had grown up 6 blocks from Sam's. House had seen the man's quiet dignity serve as an anchor point in a community that seemed to drift further from shore each year. This wasn't a random crime. Someone had specifically targeted the old soldier, and that fact alone suggested complications. Beyond a simple theft. 20 minutes later, Johnson stood in Sam's living room, taking in the scene with practiced eyes. The intruders had been efficient, but not entirely professional. They'd known what they were looking for, but hadn't expected the level of security an old Special Forces officer might maintain. Overturned furniture suggested urgency, perhaps even desperation. "They take anything specific?" Johnson asked, studying Sam's carefully composed demeanor. "Some cash, my wife's jewelry," Sam replied, his voice carrying just the right note of elderly confusion. Hard to say what else might be missing. But Johnson's 20 years on the force had taught him to read between lines. Sam's eyes held the alertness of a man trained for combat, not the confusion of a typical robbery victim. And the careful way he avoided mentioning other potential losses suggested there were items he didn't want discussed in an official report. Across town, Marcus Williams sat in the abandoned warehouse where his crew had retreated after the job. The briefcase lay on a makeshift table, its military-grade locks presenting a challenge none of them had anticipated. Tommy Martinez paced nearby, nervous energy radiating from his lean frame. "Should have grabbed the cash and run," Tommy muttered. "This thing's locked up tighter than Fort Knox." "There's a reason for that," Marcus said quietly, studying the case's construction. Military specifications, hardened steel, biometric locks that suggested contents far more valuable than jewelry or family photos. Question is, what did we just walk into? Deshaun Thompson shifted uncomfortably near the window, his conscience already weighing heavily. At 18, he was the youngest of the crew, driven by loyalty to friends rather than criminal ambition. The thought of his sister Aliyah discovering his involvement made his stomach clench with dread. "Maybe we should return it," Deshaun suggested. "Old man seemed decent enough." Tommy spun around, his face twisted with scorn. "Return it? You want to walk up to his door and apologize? Think he'll just forgive and forget?" But Marcus was thinking deeper, analyzing the situation with the strategic mind that had kept him alive on the streets. The briefcase wasn't just locked. It was protected with technology that suggested government involvement. And the old man's reaction when they'd taken it, the flash of something beyond simple fear in his eyes, hinted at connections they hadn't considered. As dawn approached Detroit, multiple forces converged on the city with purposes both aligned and contradictory. Elena's military transport lifted off from Fort Bragg, carrying a special operations team prepared for urban warfare. Agent Park's federal flight descended through morning clouds, bringing investigative resources and legal authority. Detective Johnson filed his report while mentally preparing for complications that extended far beyond his jurisdiction. And in his violated home, Sam Reeves sat in his kitchen with a cup of coffee grown cold, staring at his phone and wondering if the call he'd made would ultimately save lives or destroy them. The wolves had indeed taken the shepherd's staff, but the true hunt was only beginning. The first military vehicle arrived as the morning mist still clung to the broken streetlights of Sam's neighborhood. A black SUV with tinted windows and government plates rolled to a stop at the corner of Michigan and Trumbull, its occupants scanning the area with professional efficiency. Within minutes, 2 more vehicles followed, then a communications van disguised as a utility truck. Mrs. Chen noticed the unusual activity from her kitchen window as she prepared her morning tea. In her 78 years, she'd witnessed 2 wars and their aftermaths, learning to recognize the particular tension that preceded official action. The way the men moved, the careful positioning of their vehicles, the subtle but unmistakable establishment of a perimeter, it all felt disturbingly familiar. Elena Vasquez stepped out of the lead SUV, her combat boots connecting with Detroit. Pavement for the first time in 15 years. The neighborhood looked different than she'd imagined from Sam's occasional letters. More weathered, more wounded. Boarded windows stared like empty eyes from houses that had once held families and dreams. Yet underneath the decay, she sensed the stubborn resilience that Sam had described, the community that refused to surrender despite everything working against it. "Perimeter established, Captain," Sergeant Rodriguez reported, his voice crisp in the morning air. "Area secured for approach." Elena nodded, her eyes already fixed on the modest house she'd heard about but never seen. Sam had described it in their conversations. The small garden, the careful maintenance despite limited resources, the dignity he'd imposed on a structure that could have easily surrendered to entropy. Seeing it now, she understood something fundamental about the man who'd shaped her military career and, in many ways, her life. Detective Johnson arrived at the scene to find his jurisdiction suddenly complicated by federal presence. Agent Park emerged from a sedan, his badge already visible, his demeanor suggesting authority that trumped local law enforcement. The dynamic Johnson had dreaded was already taking shape. Multiple agencies with overlapping interests and competing priorities. "Detective Johnson, I presume," Park said, extending his hand with professional courtesy. "Agent Park, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I understand you filed the initial report." Johnson shook the offered hand while studying Park's face. Korean-American, probably early 30s, carrying himself with the careful confidence of someone accustomed to being the outsider in rooms full of power. Something about Park's intensity suggested personal investment beyond professional duty. "Routine burglary turned interesting real fast," Johnson replied. "What's the federal interest in an old man's stolen belongings?" Before Park could answer, Elena approached, her military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes. The triangle of jurisdictions was forming, military, federal, local, each with different objectives and protocols. "Captain Vasquez, Special Operations Command," Elena said, her introduction cutting through the morning tension. "I need to speak with Colonel Reeves immediately." Johnson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Colonel?" In 20 years of knowing Sam, the title had never come up in casual conversation. The old man's military background was acknowledged but never detailed, discussed with the kind of respectful distance that suggested stories better left untold. Elena's approach to Sam's front door carried the weight of years of separation and worry. When Sam answered her knock, the reunion played out in careful emotional layers, professional restraint layered over deep personal connection, relief at seeing each other tempered by the gravity of circumstances that had brought them together. "Sir," Elena said formally, though her eyes betrayed the daughter greeting a father. "Eleanor." Sam's voice carried decades of affection wrapped in military protocol. "Been too long." Their embrace was brief but genuine, witnessed by neighbors who peered from windows and porches, recognizing something significant in the careful choreography unfolding on their street. Mrs. Chen watched from across the way, her expression thoughtful, as pieces of a puzzle she'd sensed for years began clicking into place. Inside Sam's house, Elena conducted her assessment with professional thoroughness while battling personal emotions. The overturned furniture spoke of violation that went beyond material theft. This had been Sam's sanctuary, the place where he'd found peace after wars both foreign and domestic. Seeing it ransacked felt like witnessing a desecration. "Tell me about the package," Elena said, using operational language that maintained necessary distance from emotional reality. Sam's description was precise but incomplete, providing tactical details while omitting the full scope of what had been taken. Elena recognized the pattern, Sam protecting her from knowledge that could compromise her career or conscience. Even now, in crisis, he was still mentoring, still shielding her from burdens he considered his alone to bear. Meanwhile, Agent Park began his preliminary investigation, interviewing neighbors with the methodical patience that had built his reputation. The responses revealed Sam's standing in the community, respected, trusted, protective of the young. People others had written off, but underneath the surface admiration, Park detected carefully worded evasions that suggested neighbors knew more than they were willing to share with federal authority. Detective Johnson found himself caught between competing interests as more federal agents arrived, followed by additional military personnel. His community was being occupied by forces that viewed it as an operational zone rather than a place where people lived and worked and struggled to maintain dignity. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Residents beginning to move differently, children walking faster to school, elderly neighbors avoiding their usual front porch gatherings. 2 blocks away, Marcus Williams watched the military build up from the second floor of an abandoned house, his crew scattered at different observation points throughout the neighborhood. The scope of the response confirmed his growing suspicion that they'd stolen something far more significant than jewelry or family heirlooms. "How many agents you count?" Tommy's voice crackled through the burner phone, his nervousness evident even across the static-filled connection. "Enough to take down a small country," Marcus replied, studying the systematic way the authorities were positioning themselves. "This isn't about recovering stolen property. This is about containing something they're afraid of." From her position, near the school, Aaliyah Thompson recognized the signs of neighborhood lockdown from previous experiences with gang conflicts and police sweeps. But this felt different, more organized, more permanent. The authorities were digging in for an extended operation, treating their community like enemy territory. As she walked home from school, Aaliyah noticed how the military presence was affecting people she'd known her entire life. Mr. Rodriguez hurried past without his usual greeting. Mrs. Washington pulled her grandchildren inside early. The neighborhood's rhythm was disrupted, replaced by the careful tension of people learning to live under scrutiny. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The day progressed with methodical escalation. Additional checkpoints appeared at key intersections. Unmarked vehicles circulated in patterns that suggested surveillance rather than patrol. The community was being studied and catalogued, contained within boundaries that existed more in official planning than physical barriers, but were no less real for their invisibility. Elena established a command post in the community center, requiring negotiations with Preacher Jackson that revealed the delicate balance between official authority and community respect. Jackson's cooperation came with conditions that protected residents' dignity while acknowledging the necessity of federal presence. As evening approached, the neighborhood had transformed into something resembling occupied territory. The change was subtle but profound. A community that had survived urban decay, economic abandonment, and social neglect now faced the particular challenge of living under the watchful eye of authorities who saw them as potential threats rather than citizens deserving protection. Sam stood at his bedroom window as darkness fell, watching the carefully positioned vehicles and strategically placed personnel. The response he'd triggered was necessary, but painful, bringing the conflicts he'd spent 70 years trying to contain directly into the community he'd come to consider family. The briefcase was gone, but the real battle was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across Sam's living room as Agent Park settled into the chair opposite the old colonel. his notebook open and pen poised. 24 hours into the investigation, Park had developed a growing suspicion that the elderly veteran was withholding crucial information. Sam's answers were too precise, too carefully worded, carrying the calculated responses of someone. He trained in resistance to interrogation. "Let's go over this again, Colonel," Park said, emphasizing the title that had emerged from military records. "You mentioned jewelry and cash were taken. What about documents, papers, anything that might have sentimental or historical value?" Sam's hands remained steady on his coffee cup, but Park caught the microsecond pause before his response. "Old man collects a lot of paper over the years. Hard to say what might interest thieves." Park leaned forward slightly, his Korean heritage lending weight to his next words. "Records indicate you served in classified operations during the Korean conflict. Documents from that period would be considered government property, regardless of how long you've possessed them." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sam's eyes, which had maintained polite cooperation, sharpened with the focus of a man assessing potential threats. Park recognized the shift, the moment when an interview subject realizes the questioner knows more than initially apparent. "Agent Park," Sam said slowly, "some things are better left buried. Sometimes the cost of truth exceeds its value." 3 blocks away, in the abandoned Packard plant that had become their temporary headquarters, Marcus's crew grappled with their own revelations about the briefcase they'd stolen. Tommy had spent hours trying to crack the locks using techniques learned from older gang members, while Deshawn kept watch through broken windows overlooking their escape routes. "This thing's built like a damn bomb shelter," Tommy muttered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the October chill. "Military-grade everything, biometric scanners, reinforced steel, probably has a self-destruct mechanism we haven't found yet." Marcus studied the briefcase with growing unease. The lock mechanisms were more sophisticated than anything he'd encountered, suggesting contents that went far beyond personal belongings. The military response in their neighborhood confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. They'd stumbled into something that transcended simple burglary. "Maybe Dee's right," Marcus said finally. "Maybe we should find a way to return this thing before it gets worse." Tommy's laugh carried an edge of hysteria. "Return it? You see those military vehicles out there? They're not here to negotiate. They're here to disappear problems." Deshawn shifted nervously by the window, his guilt growing heavier with each passing hour. At 18, he was the baby of the crew, following Marcus's lead out of loyalty rather than criminal ambition. The thought of his sister Aaliyah getting caught up in whatever they'd unleashed made his stomach twist with dread. "Liar's been asking questions," Deshawn said quietly. "She knows something's up. Kid's too smart for her own good." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like lead. Aaliyah Thompson had been like a little sister to him since their foster care days, one of the few bright spots in a world that seemed determined to crush hope. The idea that his actions might put her in danger cut deeper than any consequence. He might face himself. While the crew wrestled with their dilemma, Marcus had managed to get word to Preacher Jackson through a network of community connections that existed below the radar of official attention. The message was simple. He needed information about the old colonel, about what kind of man they'd robbed and what kind of response they'd triggered. Preacher Jackson received the message during his afternoon visit with Mrs. Chen, who had become increasingly worried about the military presence in their neighborhood. At 67, Preacher had seen enough of life's complications to recognize when young people had gotten themselves into something beyond their understanding. "The Williams boy is asking about Sam," he told Mrs. Chen as they sat in her kitchen, away from the electronic surveillance that seemed to follow federal investigations. "Wants to know what kind of man he robbed." Mrs. Chen's expression grew thoughtful, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup. She'd kept Sam's secrets for decades, honoring the unspoken agreement between neighbors who'd both fled from wars they rarely discussed. But the current situation might require breaking old silences. "Samuel carries heavy burdens," she said carefully. "Some from the war we both remember, some from choices made in impossible circumstances. He is a good man who has done difficult things." Preacher nodded, understanding the careful language of people who'd learned to speak around painful truths. The boy needs to understand what he's stepped into. His grandfather served with Sam in Korea, died saving Sam's life, from what I can piece together. Mrs. Chen's cup stopped halfway to her lips, her eyes widening with recognition. "Williams? Who? Billy Williams? You knew him." Samuel has mentioned the name, always with respect, always with sadness. Mrs. Chen set down her cup, her expression growing grave. "If Marcus is Billy's grandson, then this is not coincidence. The past has a way of finding the present when we least expect it." Back at Sam's house, Agent Park's investigation had reached an impasse. Sam's answers remained consistent but incomplete, providing just enough cooperation to avoid obstruction. Charges, while revealing nothing substantive about the briefcase's contents. Park's frustration grew with each carefully deflected question, his instincts telling him that time was running out to recover whatever had been stolen. "Colonel, I need you to understand the gravity of this situation," Park said, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. "If classified materials are involved, withholding information constitutes a federal crime regardless of your past service." Sam's response carried the quiet dignity of someone who'd faced worse threats than legal prosecution. "Agent Park, I've carried certain responsibilities for 70 years. Those responsibilities don't end because someone broke into my house." The standoff between them represented larger conflicts: duty versus truth, loyalty versus justice, the weight of past decisions against present consequences. Park sensed he was dealing with more than a simple theft victim, while Sam recognized in the young agent someone whose investigation might uncover truths that could destroy more lives than they saved. Elena's security sweep of the neighborhood had identified the abandoned plant as a likely hiding spot for the thieves, but approaching it required delicate planning. The building sat in the heart of the community, surrounded by occupied houses and active businesses. Any military action risked civilian casualties and community backlash that could complicate the investigation for months. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Preacher Jackson made his decision. The Williams boy needed to understand the full scope of what he'd done, the connections between past and present that made this robbery more than a simple crime. Some truths were too important to remain buried, especially when they offered the possibility of redemption rather than just punishment. He reached for his phone, knowing that his next call would either save Marcus Williams or damn him, but certain that the young man deserved the chance to learn about the grandfather he'd never known and the man whose trust he'd violated. The neighborhood held too many secrets already. Perhaps it was time for some of them to see the light. The abandoned storefront on Corktown's eastern edge had served as Preacher Jackson's unofficial office for 15 years, a place where neighborhood disputes were settled and young lives redirected before the courts could intervene. Marcus Williams sat across from the community elder, his hands clenched in his lap, as Preacher spread old photographs across the scarred wooden table between them. "Your grandfather," Preacher said softly, pointing to a black-and-white image of a young soldier in Korean War fatigues, Sergeant William Billy Williams, Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion. Marcus stared at the photograph, seeing his own eyes reflected in a face he'd never known. Billy Williams looked impossibly young. In the picture, maybe 20 years old, with the same strong jawline that Marcus recognized from mirrors. All his life, Marcus had carried questions about his family history, about the grandfather who died before his birth, and left behind only fragments of stories told by foster parents who'd known little themselves. He served under Colonel Reeves. Preacher continued, his voice carrying the weight of carefully preserved history. January 1953, near a village called Sangwani. What happened there? Well, that's a story Sam's carried alone for 70 years. Preacher's investigation into Sam's background had uncovered military records, casualty reports, and sworn statements that painted a picture of heroism emerging from tragedy. The classified operation that had haunted Sam's conscience for decades involved a night assault on a suspected enemy position that had gone catastrophically wrong when intelligence proved faulty and the target turned out to be a civilian refugee camp. Your grandfather died pulling Sam and 2 other soldiers out of crossfire, Preacher said, his weathered hands tracing the edges of the photograph. Took 3 bullets in the back, kept moving until his men were safe. Sam said Billy's last words were about making sure his family back home knew he died, doing something worthwhile. Marcus felt something fundamental shifting inside his chest, like tectonic plates grinding against each other until the landscape of his identity cracked and reformed. All his life, he'd carried anger about being abandoned, about growing up, without family connections or legacy. Now, he was learning that his grandfather had died a hero, that the man he'd robbed and violated was the same person Billy Williams had given his life to protect. "I didn't know," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking like a child's. "I never knew his name, never knew how he died." "Sam's been honoring Billy's memory for 7 decades, Preacher said gently. "Every year on the anniversary, he visits Billy's grave at Arlington, pays respects, leaves flowers, tells him about the neighborhood and how things are changing. Sam never married, never had children, but he's been carrying your grandfather's memory like family." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow, doubling him over as the full weight of his actions crashed down. He'd robbed the man his grandfather died protecting. He'd violated the home of someone who'd spent 70 years honoring Billy Williams's sacrifice. The briefcase they'd stolen contained secrets that Sam had guarded not for personal gain, but out of loyalty to fallen comrades who couldn't protect their own reputations. "What was in the briefcase?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. Preacher's expression grew grave. Evidence of what really happened at Sangwani. Sam's unit was sent to eliminate a weapons cache, but the intelligence was wrong. Civilians died, including children. The documents prove it was a command failure, not a field decision, but revealing that truth would destroy the reputations of good soldiers who were just following orders. Marcus understood now why the military response had been so swift and overwhelming. The briefcase didn't just contain evidence of war crimes. It held proof of institutional failures that could topple governments and destroy the legacies of decorated veterans who'd spent their lives trying to atone for one terrible night in Korea. 3 blocks away, Elena's team had identified the abandoned Packard plant as the most likely location for the thieves' headquarters. Thermal imaging showed 3 heat signatures in the building, consistent with the number of suspects Detective Johnson had identified from neighborhood canvas. But Elena hesitated to authorize a direct assault, knowing that aggressive action could result in the documents being destroyed or the suspects being killed before they could provide information about the briefcase's current location. "We need to flush them out," Sergeant Rodriguez suggested during the tactical briefing. "Cut power to the building, use tear gas, force them into the open where we can control the situation." Elena studied the building schematics on her tablet, calculating angles and escape routes while considering the human cost of each option. These weren't international terrorists or hardened criminals. They were neighborhood kids who'd made a devastating mistake. Sam wouldn't want their blood on his conscience, along with all the other weights he carried. "Negative," Elena decided. We maintain surveillance and wait for them to move. I want them alive and talking, not martyred in a firefight that could have been avoided. At the Pentagon, General Hayes was reaching different conclusions about proportional response. The secure video conference with her staff revealed the political implications of the stolen documents, implications that extended far beyond military. Concerns into the realm of international diplomacy and domestic politics. Every hour those documents remain missing increases the risk of catastrophic exposure, Hayes argued, her voice sharp with authority. The Korean government has already started asking questions about recent military activity in Detroit. If they suspect we're covering up war crimes from the 1950s, it could destabilize our entire Pacific Alliance structure. Agent Park found himself caught between competing pressures as his investigation revealed the personal connections underlying the case. Computer analysis of military records had uncovered the relationship between Marcus Williams and Sergeant Billy Williams, adding layers of complexity to what had initially appeared to be a random crime. The revelation that Marcus was Billy's grandson created both opportunity and obligation. It provided leverage for negotiation, a way to appeal to the young man's better nature through family honor. But it also raised questions about whether Marcus's actions were truly random or somehow connected to unresolved issues from his grandfather's service. As evening approached, Marcus made his decision. The weight of his grandfather's sacrifice and Sam's decades of loyalty demanded action that transcended his crew's immediate safety. Tommy and Deshawn might not understand, might even try to stop him, but Marcus knew what Billy Williams would have expected from his grandson. "I have to return it," Marcus told Preacher, his voice steady despite the tears still wet on his cheeks. "Whatever's in that briefcase, it belongs with Sam. My grandfather died protecting him, and I've spent my whole life dishonoring that sacrifice." Preacher nodded, recognizing the moment when a young man chooses his path toward redemption or destruction. "It won't be easy. Your crew won't understand, and the authorities won't necessarily believe your change of heart is genuine." "Doesn't matter," Marcus replied, standing with new purpose. "Some things are more important than easy." As he walked back toward the abandoned plant, Marcus carried the weight of his grandfather's legacy and the knowledge that his next decision would determine whether the Williams name would be remembered for honor or betrayal. The briefcase that had seemed like salvation now felt like the heaviest burden he'd ever carried. But for the first time in his life, Marcus Williams knew exactly who he was supposed to be. Agent Park found Sam in his backyard garden as dawn broke over Detroit, the old colonel's hands working soil that had absorbed decades of careful tending. The federal investigator had spent a sleepless night reviewing classified files that painted an increasingly complex picture of the Korean War operation, and he could no longer approach this case with the detached professionalism his training demanded. "Colonel Reeves," Park said quietly, not wanting to startle the elderly man, "we need to talk about Sangwon-ni." Sam's hands stilled on the tomato plant he'd been staking, his shoulders tensing with the recognition that his carefully maintained silence was finally cracking. He'd known this moment would come eventually. The past had a way of surfacing no matter how deep you buried it. "You've been reading classified files," Sam said without turning around, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd carried secrets too long. "Found things that made the theft of my briefcase more than a simple burglary." Park moved closer, studying the precise way Sam arranged his garden tools, despite the emotional weight of their conversation. The operation was designated as a tactical success in official reports. Enemy weapons cache destroyed, minimal friendly casualties, but the classified addendum tells a different story. Sam finally turned to face the young agent, and Park was struck by the depth of pain in the old man's eyes. 70 years of carrying guilt had carved lines in Sam's face that spoke of sleepless nights and constant second-guessing of decisions. made in the chaos of combat. Intelligence was wrong, Sam said simply. What we thought was a weapons depot turned out to be a refugee camp. Families hiding from the fighting, trying to keep their children safe. We went in hard and fast, followed our orders exactly, and when the smoke cleared, the words hung between them like physical objects, weighted with the gravity of innocent lives lost and the institutional machinery that had covered up the truth to protect larger strategic interests. Park felt his own family history stirring. In response to Sam's confession, his grandfather's stories of fleeing Seoul, of refugee camps that offered sanctuary to those caught between armies. "How many civilians?" Park asked, though he dreaded the answer. 17, including 6 children. Sam's voice broke slightly on the numbers he'd memorized and carried like stones in his chest for 7 decades. The documents in that briefcase contain the real after-action reports, witness statements, photographs, evidence that could destroy careers, reputations, families of good soldiers who were just following orders. Park understood now why the military response had been so swift and overwhelming. The briefcase didn't just contain proof of war crimes. It held evidence of institutional cover-ups that reached into the highest levels of government, documentation that could unravel decades of carefully constructed narratives about American conduct during the Korean conflict. "Why keep them?" Park asked. "Why not destroy the evidence and let the past stay buried?" Sam's answer revealed the moral complexity that had defined his post-war life. Because 17 people died that night, and someone needs to remember their names. Someone needs to carry the weight of what we did, even if that weight never becomes public knowledge. 3 blocks away, the confrontation Marcus had been dreading was finally erupting in the abandoned Packard plant. Tommy had discovered Marcus's plan to return the briefcase, and his reaction was exactly what Marcus had feared: rage mixed with desperation and the particular fury of someone who felt betrayed by a trusted leader. "You're going to get us all killed," Tommy snarled, his hand moving toward the knife he carried on his belt. "That briefcase is our ticket out of this neighborhood, our chance to start over somewhere else, and you want to just give it back." "It's not ours to keep," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the tension crackling between them. "We robbed a good man, took something that doesn't belong to us, and triggered a response that could destroy this whole community." Deshawn watched the confrontation from across the room, torn between loyalty to his crew and growing certainty that Marcus was right. The military presence in their neighborhood was escalating daily, turning their community into occupied territory where residents moved with the careful wariness of people living under surveillance. "My sister's scared," Deshawn said quietly. "Aaliyah comes home from school every day, asking why there are soldiers on our streets. She's smart enough to know something big is happening, and she's starting to ask questions about why I've been disappearing." Tommy's laugh carried an edge of hysteria. "Your sister, his guilt. You think any of that matters to the feds breathing down our necks? They'll disappear us just to keep their secrets safe." But Marcus had moved beyond fear of consequences, driven by the revelation of his grandfather's sacrifice and the knowledge that his actions had dishonored a legacy of service. "Billy Williams died protecting that old man. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life knowing I betrayed what my grandfather stood for." The mention of Marcus's grandfather shifted something in the dynamic between the 3 young men. Tommy's rage faltered slightly as he recognized the deeper currents driving Marcus's decision, while Deshawn felt his own resolve strengthening around the possibility of redemption rather than just survival. Elena's surveillance team had been monitoring the abandoned plant through thermal imaging and directional microphones, tracking the escalating conflict inside the building. The audio surveillance revealed the crew's internal divisions and Marcus's apparent willingness to return. The stolen briefcase, information that changed the tactical equation significantly. "We have an opportunity," Eleanor reported to her command post. "The primary suspect appears ready to cooperate. If we can isolate him from the other two, we might resolve this without violence." But Elena's plans were complicated by increasing pressure from General Hayes, who was growing impatient with the careful approach Elena favored. The Pentagon's political calculations demanded swift resolution before the stolen documents could be leaked or used against American interests in the complex web of international relations that still surrounded Korean War legacy issues. "Every hour of delay increases the risk," Hayes argued during their encrypted video conference. "We need those documents secured and the witnesses contained, permanently if necessary." The cold calculation in Hayes's voice chilled Elena, reminding her of the institutional machinery that prioritized organizational protection over individual lives. Sam had taught her that true military leadership meant accepting responsibility for difficult decisions, but Hayes seemed more concerned with avoiding accountability than serving justice. As the sun climbed higher over Detroit, multiple forces converged on the abandoned plant where three young men wrestled with choices that would define the rest of their lives. Marcus's decision to return the briefcase had set events in motion that could lead to redemption or tragedy, depending on whether wisdom or expediency would guide the authorities' response. Sam stood in his garden, still talking with Agent Park about burdens carried too long and truths that demanded acknowledgement. The briefcase was gone, but the real reckoning was just beginning, forcing everyone involved to confront the true cost of loyalty, justice, and the decisions that echo across generations. The explosion of violence inside the abandoned Packard plant shattered the morning quiet as Marcus and Tommy's philosophical differences became physical reality. Elena's surveillance team heard the crash of overturned furniture through their directional microphones, followed by shouting that made clear the crew's unity had finally fractured beyond repair. "Tommy, stop!" Deshawn's voice cut through the chaos as the volatile young man lunged at Marcus, fury driving him beyond rational thought. The briefcase skittered across the concrete floor, its military-grade construction protecting it from the impact as the two leaders of the crew grappled for control. Elena made her decision in the span of heartbeats. "Alpha Team, move in. Bravo Team, secure the perimeter. I want containment, not casualties." Her Special Forces operators advanced on the building with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated through years of training in urban warfare. But as they approached, the situation inside deteriorated further when Aaliyah Thompson appeared at the plant's rear entrance, having tracked her brother Deshawn through a network of neighborhood knowledge that existed below official radar. "D!" Aaliyah called out, her 16-year-old voice carrying across the vast, empty space of the factory floor. "I know you're in here. We need to talk." Her arrival transformed an already volatile situation into something approaching catastrophe. Tommy, desperate and cornered, saw opportunity in the form of an innocent bystander who could serve as leverage. Before Marcus could react, Tommy had broken away from their struggle and grabbed Aaliyah, his knife appearing at her throat with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned violence as survival. "Back off!" Tommy shouted toward the approaching military team, his voice echoing off the plant's broken windows. "Everyone just back the hell off, or the girl gets hurt." Detective Johnson arrived at the scene as Elena's team was establishing the perimeter, his community policing instincts immediately recognizing the dangerous escalation. He'd spent 20 years trying to prevent exactly this kind of situation. Neighborhood kids caught between desperation and authority, with civilians trapped in the crossfire. "That's Aaliyah Thompson," Johnson told Elena, his voice tight with concern. "On a student, dreams of becoming a lawyer, volunteers at the community center. She's one of the good ones, Captain. We can't let her become collateral damage." Elena felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders like armor plating. Every decision from this point forward would determine whether she went home with a successful mission or the knowledge that an innocent girl had died on her watch. The briefcase remained important, but not more important than Alia's life. Inside the plant, Marcus faced the devastating consequences of his attempt at redemption. His decision to return the stolen documents had triggered exactly the kind of violence he'd hoped to avoid. And now the person he cared about most in the world was paying the price for his choices. "Let her go, Tommy," Marcus said carefully, his hands raised to show he posed no threat. "This is between us. Alia doesn't have anything to do with what we did." Tommy's laugh carried the bitter edge of someone who'd finally reached his breaking point. "Nothing to do with it? She's the reason Dee's been whining about conscience, the reason you've been talking about returning stolen property like we're in some after-school special about doing the right thing." Deshawn watched his sister's terrified face and felt something. Fundamental shift inside his chest. All his life, he'd followed Marcus's lead because he respected the older boy's intelligence and street wisdom. But seeing Alia threatened made him realize that some loyalties transcended crew bonds. Some relationships mattered more than survival. "Tommy, please," Deshawn said, his voice breaking with emotion. "She's all the family I got left. Whatever happens to me, whatever trouble we're in, she doesn't deserve this." Agent Park monitored the situation from Elena's command post. His investigation files spread across a makeshift table as he tried to understand the personal connections that had transformed a simple theft into a neighborhood crisis. The relationship between Marcus and Sam, the family bond between Deshawn and Alia, the community ties that made this more than just a law enforcement operation. "The Thompson girl isn't random," Park told Elena. "She's been Marcus Williams' surrogate sister since foster care. He's been protecting her from gang involvement for years, if we can appeal to that protective instinct." But Elena was already thinking tactically, calculating angles and sightlines while considering the human cost of each potential action. Her sniper teams had positioned themselves in adjacent buildings, waiting for clear shots that might not come if Tommy kept Alia close as a human shield. Sam Reeves arrived at the scene against all safety protocols, having learned about the situation from Mrs. Chen's network of neighborhood watchers. At 92, he moved slowly, but with unmistakable authority, his military bearing intact despite his age and the chaos surrounding him. "Colonel, you need to stay back," Elena said, though her tone carried more respect than command. "This is an active tactical situation." "That young man is Billy Williams' grandson," Sam replied, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of military experience. "And that girl doesn't deserve to suffer for mistakes made by desperate children. Sometimes old soldiers need to finish what they started." Sam's presence had an immediate effect on everyone involved. The federal agents recognized his legendary status within military circles, while Detective Johnson saw a community elder whose moral authority transcended official jurisdiction. Even the surveillance teams monitoring communications noted the change in tone when Sam appeared on scene. Inside the plant, Marcus could see his limited options narrowing to impossible choices. Tommy's desperation was escalating toward violence. Alia's terror was breaking his heart. And the military response outside meant that any attempt to resolve the situation might end in bloodshed that would haunt the survivors forever. "The briefcase," Marcus called out toward the hidden surveillance devices he knew were recording everything. "I'll tell you where the briefcase is. Give you everything you want if you guarantee safe passage for Alia and Deshawn. They're not criminals, they're just kids who got caught up in my mistake." Elena heard the offer through her communication system and recognized the moment when negotiation became possible. Marcus Williams had moved beyond self-preservation to focus on protecting others, demonstrating the kind of character transformation that offered hope for peaceful resolution. But Tommy's response shattered that hope like glass against concrete. "Nobody's making deals without me," he snarled, pressing the knife closer to Aaliyah's throat until a thin line of blood appeared on her dark skin. "We all walk away together, or nobody walks away at all." The standoff had reached its crisis point, with multiple armed forces surrounding a desperate young man holding an innocent girl hostage, while inside the plant, 3 lives hung in the balance of decisions made. In desperation and fear, the briefcase that had started everything lay forgotten on the concrete floor, its secret suddenly less important than the question of whether anyone would survive to face the consequences of their choices. Sam Reeves stepped forward despite Elena's protests, his weathered hands raised in the universal gesture of peaceful approach. At 92, his body moved with the careful precision of age, but his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who'd commanded men in life-and-death situations for decades. "Son," Sam called toward the broken windows of the abandoned plant, his words echoing across the empty space between them. "I know who you are. I know your grandfather. Billy Williams was the finest soldier I ever served with, and he died saving my life." Inside the factory, Tommy's grip on Aaliyah tightened as confusion flickered across his face. The hostage situation had been about leverage, about creating bargaining power in a desperate situation, but the old man's words suggested connections and complications that Tommy didn't understand and couldn't control. "You're lying," Tommy shouted back, though uncertainty crept into his voice. Old man trying to talk his way out of trouble. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs as Sam's words confirmed everything Preacher Jackson had revealed about his grandfather's heroic death. The knowledge that Billy Williams had died protecting this elderly colonel added layers of meaning to the current crisis that went far beyond stolen documents or criminal charges. "January 15th, 1953, Sam continued, his voice steady, despite the tactical weapons aimed in his direction. "Hill 317, near Sangwon-ni. Your grandfather took 3 bullets in the back, pulling me and 2 other soldiers out of an ambush." His last words were about making sure his family knew he died for something worthwhile. The specific details hit Marcus like physical blows, confirming the truth of Sam's statement in ways that generic claims couldn't match. Deshawn watched, his friend's face transform as the weight of family legacy collided with present reality, creating a moment of recognition that changed everything about their situation. Elena coordinated with her sniper teams through hand signals, knowing that conversation was buying time but not necessarily resolving the crisis. Tommy remained unpredictable, his desperation making him dangerous to everyone, including himself. But Sam's revelation about Marcus's grandfather had shifted the emotional dynamics inside the plant, creating opportunities that hadn't existed moments before. "Tommy," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying new authority born from understanding his family's legacy of sacrifice, "let her go. Whatever trouble we're in, whatever consequences we face, Aaliyah doesn't deserve to pay for our mistakes." But Tommy's response revealed the depth of his desperation and the particular fury of someone who felt abandoned by those he'd trusted. Your grandfather, his sacrifice, all this honor and family bullshit. Where was any of that when we were sleeping in doorways and eating out of dumpsters? Where was honor when the system threw us away like garbage? Agent Park monitored the negotiations from Elena's command post, while reviewing the psychological profiles his team had compiled on the 3 suspects. Tommy Martinez had spent his entire life in foster care and juvenile detention, bouncing between systems that had failed him repeatedly. His volatility came from a lifetime of betrayal by authority figures who'd promised help and delivered disappointment. "He's not going to surrender peacefully," Park told Elena. Martinez has no reason to trust official promises. In his experience, cooperation just leads to more punishment. Elena absorbed this assessment while calculating the tactical realities of their situation. Her snipers had partial sightlines on Tommy's position, but Aaliyah's proximity made any shot extremely risky. The plant's industrial architecture created angles and shadows that could hide movement until it was too late to prevent tragedy. Detective Johnson worked to coordinate with the growing crowd of neighborhood residents who'd gathered at the police perimeter, their concern for Aaliyah creating additional pressure on everyone involved. Mrs. Chen stood with Preacher Jackson, both community elders recognizing that this crisis would define their neighborhood's relationship with law enforcement for years to come. "That child has never hurt anyone," Mrs. Chen told Johnson, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd watched Aaliyah grow up. "She volunteers at the community center, helps elderly neighbors with groceries, dreams of becoming a lawyer to help people. If she dies because of government secrets and old wars, this community will never forgive." Inside the plant, Deshawn made his decision with the clarity that comes from seeing someone you love in mortal danger. His sister's terrified face had stripped away all considerations of crew loyalty or personal consequences, leaving only the fundamental truth that some things mattered more than survival. "I'm done," Deshawn announced, stepping away from Tommy with his hands raised. "Whatever happens to me, I'm not part of this anymore. Aaliyah, I'm sorry. I never wanted you to get hurt because of the stupid choices I made." His defection left Tommy more isolated, but also more dangerous, his knife hand trembling with adrenaline and rage as he realized his support system was crumbling around him. Marcus and Deshawn's moral awakening represented everything he'd learned. Not to trust, the idea that doing the right thing would somehow lead to better outcomes. "You think surrendering makes you heroes?" Tommy screamed, his voice cracking with emotion. "You think they're going to pat you on the head and send you home? We're dead either way. Might as well take some of them with us." Sam continued his slow approach toward the plant entrance, each step measured and deliberate, despite Elena's urgent hand signals to maintain distance. His military experience told him that Tommy was reaching the breaking point where negotiation would become impossible, where desperate people made choices that destroyed everyone around them. "Son," Sam called again, his voice cutting through Tommy's rage with grandfatherly authority. "I've seen what happens when good people make bad choices under impossible circumstances. I've carried that weight for 70 years, and I'm telling you it doesn't have to end in more tragedy." The moment stretched like a taut wire as multiple forces balanced on the edge of violence. Elena's finger hovered near her radio, ready to authorize sniper action if Tommy's behavior escalated further. Marcus gathered himself for a desperate attempt to protect Aaliyah, knowing that his next action might be his last. Deshawn prayed to whatever gods watched over foolish children caught in circumstances beyond their understanding. And in that crystalline instant when everything could go either way, Marcus Williams made the choice that would define his grandfather's legacy and his own future. He lunged toward Tommy with the same desperate courage that had driven Billy Williams to charge into enemy fire 70 years before, proving that heroism could transcend generations and that some bonds of honor were stronger than death itself. The gunshot echoed through the abandoned Packard plant like thunder in a cathedral, reverberating off broken machinery and shattered windows before dying in the industrial silence that followed. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, nobody moved, not Elena's tactical teams positioned outside, not Agent Park monitoring from the command post, not Detective Johnson coordinating with neighborhood residents who'd gathered behind police barriers. The only sound was Aaliyah's sharp intake of breath and the metallic clatter of Tommy's knife hitting concrete. Marcus Williams lay on the factory floor, crimson spreading across his left shoulder, where Tommy's desperate shot had found its mark. But Aaliyah was free, stumbling away from her captor as Deshawn rushed to embrace his sister, both of them sobbing with relief and terror. Tommy stood frozen, the smoking gun in his hand, suddenly feeling like the weight of his entire wasted life. "Medical team, move in now," Eleanor commanded through her comm system, her training overriding the emotional complexity of watching a young man bleed because he'd chosen courage over self-preservation. "Suspect is down, hostage secure, situation contained but not resolved." Sam Reeves reached the plant entrance as Elena's medics rushed past him, his 92-year-old legs carrying him faster than they had in years. The sight of Marcus wounded on the concrete floor triggered memories of another young soldier who'd taken bullets meant for others, another Williams who'd bled for principles larger than personal survival. "Easy, son," Sam said, kneeling beside Marcus with surprising agility for his age. "You did good. Your grandfather would be proud." Marcus's eyes focused on Sam's face through the haze of pain and shock, seeing in the old colonel's expression something he'd never encountered before. Unconditional acceptance from a father figure who understood sacrifice. Blood soaked through his jacket, but Marcus felt lighter than he had in years, as if the bullet had somehow carried away the anger and desperation that had driven him toward crime. "The briefcase," Marcus whispered, his voice weak but determined. "Behind the machinery. I never opened it. Whatever secrets you're carrying, they're still yours." Agent Park coordinated the evidence recovery while paramedics worked on Marcus's shoulder wound, their professional assessment suggesting the injury was serious but not life-threatening. The briefcase sat exactly where Marcus had indicated, its military-grade locks intact, and its contents still secure after 3 days in the hands of people who could have destroyed or sold everything Sam had spent 70 years protecting. Detective Johnson supervised Tommy's arrest with the weary professionalism of someone who'd seen too many young lives destroyed by choices made in desperation. Tommy offered no resistance, his fight draining away the moment he'd pulled the trigger and realized that violence had solved nothing, only created new problems that would follow him for whatever remained of his freedom. Kids looking at attempted murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, Johnson told Elena as they watched Tommy being loaded into a police transport. 25 to life, probably. Shame, he's smart enough to have made something of himself under different circumstances. Elena nodded, understanding the tragedy of wasted potential that seemed to define too many young lives in neighborhoods like this one. But her attention was focused on Marcus, who was being prepared for transport to Detroit General Hospital under federal protective custody. His cooperation had been crucial, but Elena knew that the legal system didn't always reward moral growth with proportional mercy. As the immediate crisis subsided, the broader implications of the past 3 days began to emerge. General Hayes arrived in Detroit that afternoon, her Pentagon authority cutting through local jurisdictions like a blade through paper. Her assessment of the situation carried the cold calculation of someone whose career depended on controlling narratives that could damage American interests. "The documents are secure," Hayes told Elena during their private briefing at the federal building downtown. "The suspects are in custody. The investigation is concluded. Colonel Reeves will receive appropriate recognition for his service, and the classified materials will be permanently archived where they belong." But Elena heard the subtext in Hayes's words. The investigation was being concluded, not resolved. The moral complexities that had driven the crisis were being buried beneath official procedures that prioritized institutional protection over individual justice. Marcus Williams had risked his life to return stolen documents and protect an innocent girl, but the legal system would still prosecute him according to the letter of the law rather than the spirit of his redemption. 3 weeks later, Marcus sat in a hospital bed at Detroit General, his shoulder healing but his future uncertain. Federal prosecutors had offered a plea agreement that would reduce his charges in exchange for testimony about gang activities in his neighborhood, but accepting it would require betraying friends and community members who'd never wronged him. The choice between personal salvation and collective loyalty felt like another test of the character his grandfather had died defending. Sam visited daily, bringing books and stories that filled the gaps in Marcus's understanding of his family. History. Through these conversations, Marcus learned about Billy Williams, not just as a war hero, but as a young man from Detroit who'd enlisted to escape poverty and found purpose in protecting others. The parallels between grandfather and grandson weren't lost on either man. Billy was angry when he first joined up, Sam told Marcus during one afternoon visit. Angry at the system that had failed his family, angry at the circumstances that had limited his choices. But he learned to channel that anger into something constructive, something that helped others instead of just destroying what he couldn't control. Marcus absorbed these lessons with the hunger of someone discovering his identity after years of feeling disconnected from any meaningful legacy. The federal prosecutor's plea offer remained on the table, but Marcus found himself more interested in Sam's stories about Korean War veterans who'd returned home to build community organizations, start businesses, and mentor young people who faced the same challenges they'd overcome. Agent Park's final report on the case reflected the moral complexity that had defined the investigation from its beginning. His recommendation regarding Sam's potential prosecution for concealing classified documents emphasized the colonel's lifetime of service and the extenuating circumstances that had motivated his silence. The Korean War operation had been a tragedy born of faulty intelligence and institutional failures, not criminal intent by field commanders who'd followed orders under impossible conditions. Colonel Reeves has carried the burden of Sangwon-ni for 70 years, Park wrote in his classified summary. Prosecuting him now would serve no purpose except institutional revenge against someone who's already paid a price far exceeding any court-imposed penalty. The classified documents he protected contain evidence that could damage American interests if made public, but they also represent the conscience of a soldier who refused to let victims be forgotten, even when secrecy was required. Park's recommendation against prosecution reflected both professional assessment and personal connection to the case. Learning about his own grandfather's experiences as a Korean War refugee had given him insight into the civilian cost of military operations, creating empathy for both victims and soldiers who'd carried guilt across decades. Justice, Park concluded, sometimes required mercy rather than punishment. Deshaun Thompson's legal troubles were resolved through community service and probation, thanks to Detective Johnson's advocacy and character testimony from teachers and neighbors who'd watched him struggle between gang loyalty and family responsibility. His decision to surrender and protect his sister had demonstrated moral courage that courts could recognize and reward, offering hope for rehabilitation rather than just punishment. Aaliyah Thompson returned to school with determination, strengthened by her ordeal. Her dreams of becoming a lawyer now focused specifically on helping young people navigate the legal system that had nearly destroyed her brother. She visited Marcus regularly during his recovery, their conversations revealing a maturity born from confronting adult consequences while still maintaining faith in the possibility of redemption. General Hayes's political calculations ultimately favored institutional discretion over public prosecution. The classified documents were permanently sealed in government archives, their contents known only to a select few officials who understood the delicate balance between historical truth and contemporary interests. Sam's secrets would remain buried, but his conscience would finally be free from the weight of carrying them alone. Elena's debriefing with her superiors emphasized the successful recovery of classified materials and the containment of potential security breaches. But privately, she struggled with questions about the military's role in civilian communities. Her special forces training had prepared her for international conflicts, not domestic operations that required balancing federal authority with community trust. The sight of military vehicles occupying an American neighborhood would haunt her long after returning to active duty. Mrs. Chen organized community meetings to address the trauma of military occupation and discuss ways to prevent future incidents that could bring federal attention to their neighborhood. These gatherings revealed the resilience of residents who'd survived urban decay, economic abandonment, and social neglect without losing faith in their community's potential for renewal. The crisis had been devastating, but it had also demonstrated the strength of bonds between neighbors who cared for each other despite official indifference. Preacher Jackson's community center became a focal point for discussions about youth mentorship and gang intervention, with Sam volunteering to share his military experience with young men who needed positive role models. The program that emerged from these conversations created structured alternatives to street life, offering purpose and direction to teenagers who might otherwise follow the path that had led Marcus toward crime. 6 months after the crisis, Marcus Williams stood before a federal judge for sentencing, his shoulder fully healed, but his life fundamentally transformed by the events that had begun with a desperate burglary. The courtroom was packed with community supporters. Mrs. Chen, Preacher Jackson, Detective Johnson, even Eleanor, who'd taken leave to attend the hearing. Their presence represented the possibility of redemption that the legal system sometimes struggled to recognize. Sam Reeves testified on Marcus's behalf, his words carrying the authority of decades in uniform and the moral weight of someone who'd faced his own moral reckoning. "This young man made a terrible mistake," Sam told the court. "But when faced with the consequences of his actions, he chose courage over cowardice, honor over self-preservation. His grandfather died protecting others, and Marcus has proven that same spirit lives in him." The judge's sentence reflected both the seriousness of Marcus's crimes and the extraordinary circumstances of his cooperation and moral transformation. 5 years in federal prison, with the possibility of early release for good behavior and continued community service. It was severe but not crushing, punishment tempered by recognition that redemption was possible for those willing to earn it. As Marcus was led away to begin serving his sentence, he carried with him the knowledge that his grandfather's legacy lived on, that the choices he'd made in crisis had honored rather than betrayed the sacrifice Billy Williams had made 70 years before. The briefcase was secure, Sam's secrets were safe, and a young man had learned that courage could be inherited across generations by those willing to claim it. The neighborhood gradually returned to its normal rhythms, though changed by the knowledge that heroes could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances and that the past never truly died, but could be redeemed by those brave enough to face its consequences with honor. 6 months after the crisis that had transformed their neighborhood into a battlefield, Sam Reeves stood in his backyard garden, watching the morning sun illuminate tomatoes that had somehow thrived despite everything that had transpired. The plants seemed larger this year, more resilient, as if they'd drawn strength from the chaos that had nearly destroyed the community around them. Marcus Williams would be released in 18 months, his federal sentence reduced for exceptional cooperation and the character testimony that had painted a picture of redemption rather than recidivism. Sam's weekly visits to the federal facility in Milan had become a cornerstone of both their lives, conversations that bridged 70 years of history and offered hope for a future neither man had expected to see. "Your grandfather would understand," Sam had told Marcus during their most recent visit, speaking about the young man's decision to testify against Tommy Martinez in exchange for a reduced sentence. Sometimes loyalty to larger principles requires difficult choices about immediate relationships. The community center on Michigan Avenue bustled with activity that would have seemed impossible during the dark days of military occupation. Preacher Jackson's programs had expanded to include job training, educational support, and mentorship opportunities that connected young people with positive role models rather than gang recruiters. Sam had become a regular volunteer, his military stories offering lessons about discipline, honor, and service that resonated with teenagers hungry for purpose. Aaliyah Thompson, now 17 and preparing for college applications, had established a scholarship fund in her brother Deshawn's name, though Deshawn was very much alive and thriving in his first year of military service. His decision to enlist had surprised everyone except Sam, who recognized the particular calling that drew young men towards structured service when civilian life offered too few meaningful challenges. "He writes every week," Aaliyah told Sam as they worked together in the community center's tutoring program. "Says the Army reminds him of what you taught Marcus about channeling anger into something constructive. He wants to become a military police officer, help other kids avoid the mistakes he made." Elena Vasquez had requested transfer to a domestic posting that allowed regular visits to Detroit, her conversations with Sam providing continuity to their mentor-student relationship while helping her process the moral complexities of serving institutions that sometimes prioritized organizational protection over individual justice. Her experience with the classified documents recovery had taught her that true military leadership required questioning orders when they conflicted with fundamental principles of honor. The briefcase that had triggered 3 days of neighborhood occupation now rested in a secure government archive, its contents known only to a handful of officials who understood the delicate balance between historical truth and contemporary stability. Agent Park's final report had recommended permanent classification, arguing that the documents served no current investigative purpose and that public disclosure would harm living individuals without providing meaningful justice for past wrongs. Sam found peace in knowing that the burden he'd carried for 70 years was finally shared, even if the sharing occurred within official channels rather than public acknowledgement. The 17 civilians who died at Sangwon Ni would never receive public recognition, but their names were preserved in classified records where future historians might someday find them and tell their stories with appropriate context and sensitivity. Mrs. Chen had become Sam's closest confidant during the months following the crisis, their weekly tea ceremonies providing opportunities to discuss memories they'd never shared during 3 decades of careful neighborly distance. Her own experiences as a Korean War refugee had given her insight into the civilian cost of military operations, creating understanding that transcended cultural and generational differences. "The past cannot be changed," she told Sam during one afternoon conversation, "but the present can be shaped by how we choose to remember and honor what came before. Your burden was not yours alone to carry." Detective Johnson's relationship with federal authorities had been permanently altered by the crisis, his advocacy for community interests during the investigation earning respect from agencies that typically ignored local concerns. His recommendation that Marcus Williams receive consideration for early release had carried weight with parole boards that recognized the value of community support in rehabilitation programs. The house that had been violated by desperate young men seeking easy money had become a gathering place for neighborhood activities that built connections between generations and cultures. Sam's stories about military service provided context for conflicts that seemed abstract to young people. while their questions about contemporary challenges helped him understand how historical patterns repeated in different forms. Tommy Martinez's trial had concluded with a conviction for armed robbery, kidnapping, and attempted murder, resulting in a 25-year sentence that effectively ended his young life before it had truly begun. Sam attended the sentencing hearing not to celebrate justice, but to witness the tragic waste of potential that occurred when systemic failures combined with individual choices to create irreversible consequences. Agent Park had been promoted within the FBI's Domestic Security Division, his handling of the classified documents case earning recognition for balancing national security concerns with constitutional protections and community relations. His Korean heritage had provided cultural insight that proved valuable in understanding the historical complexities underlying the investigation, leading to assignments that required similar sensitivity to immigrant communities and their relationships with American institutions. The abandoned Packard plant, where the final confrontation had occurred, was scheduled for demolition, its industrial ruins finally giving way to community development projects that would bring jobs and services to a neighborhood that had survived decades of economic abandonment. The symbolism wasn't lost on residents who understood that renewal sometimes required destroying old structures to build something better. As evening approached, Sam prepared for his weekly dinner with Mrs. Chen, Aaliyah, and whoever else from the neighborhood felt like joining their informal gathering. These meals had evolved from their private tea ceremonies into community events that celebrated the connections forged through shared crisis and mutual support. The briefcase was gone, but the secrets it had contained no longer haunted Sam's dreams. Marcus Williams was serving his sentence with dignity and purpose, using his time to earn his GED and prepare for the community leadership role that awaited his release. The neighborhood had survived military occupation and emerged stronger, its residents more connected to each other and more confident in their ability to face whatever challenges the future might bring. In his garden, Sam's tomatoes continued to grow toward the light, rooted in soil that had absorbed both tears and blood, but still produced life. The past couldn't be changed, but the future remained unwritten, shaped by the choices of ordinary people who chose courage over convenience and community over isolation. Some foundations, once properly laid, could support whatever structures dared to rise upon them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.